In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Soul Samurai build. This is a New Game Plus Samurai build that is a Dexterity Intelligence build that focuses on the use of using a katana, in this case the Nagakiba, as well as using some magic spells. If you've been trying to play a magic samurai type build and you're looking for a good alternative to the Moonveil, which seems to be what a lot of people are using, then you might want to check out this build. Before I get into the weapons and armor real quick though, I just want to mention the reason that this is a New Game Plus build, and that's mostly because of the stat distribution. Anytime that you're playing a build where you're using a weapon that does 100% physical damage that scales off like dexterity or scales off strength, like if you're playing like a heavy infusion or a keen infusion, and then you're using your incantation scaling or your sorcery scaling that comes with your faith or intelligence stats to buff that, you need a lot of stats in order to make that pay off, and that's a great way to take a weapon into New Game Plus and still continue to get damage out of it. If you're playing in New Game, you know, magic or cold might be a better option for you because you need less stat investment in order to get damage out of that weapon. But when you're going into New Game Plus, if you are getting all your physical damage out of one stat and all your magic damage out of another stat, you can invest more stats in order to get even more damage. So let's talk about the weapon we're using with this build. I am using the Nagakiba, arguably one of my favorite overall weapons in this game. I have done actually another build, if you remember the Blazing Bushido build with this weapon. But in this one, we're using the Keen scaling in order to use dexterity for the physical damage of this weapon. It has very good dexterity scaling. And I'm using the double slash Ash of War on it. You can use other Ashes of War if you want, like Sword Dance or Repeated Thrusts or whatever you want. But I really like double slash for this. And I've got it, as I mentioned, set to the Keen affinity, so you're going to get all your damage, the physical damage, from dexterity here. When it comes to the staff I'm using for this build, I have the Academy Glintstone staff. I have that maxed out. And the reason for that really is that my intelligence at this point is at 60. As you go through NG+, and your dexterity and intelligence get higher, you'll probably swap this out for the Carrion Regal Scepter at some point. But at this point of the game, the Academy Glintstone staff actually outperforms the Carrion Regal Scepter because my intelligence is not high enough. The Carrion Regal Scepter really shines between that 70 to 80 intelligence range, so when you're approaching about 70 intelligence, you'll probably want to swap over to that. But for the moment, this is a better staff. When it comes to the armor I'm using for this build, there are a lot of different ways you can go. You can try and get, enough poise that you can attack through attacks without getting staggered or most regular attacks. Or you can stay light if you want to roll more, or you can go for that medium roll option to give you somewhere in the middle. I'm sort of using like the Black Knife set here. I have a chest piece that's a little bit different just for visual appearance because I like it. But if you're using the Black Knife armor set, then you'll muffle your sound while you're moving around, which will allow you to get the drop on some enemies who don't see you. The armor isn't super important though, so make sure you just pick whatever you like here. We don't have a ton of points in endurance, because the way our stat spread is kind of crazy. So you're not going to have a lot of points in endurance unless you're sacrificing some intelligence or dexterity, which I don't recommend doing. When it comes to talismans I have for this build, I'm using Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm, Millicent's Prosthesis, and Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. Shard of Alexander is there to increase the damage with double slash. If you're using a different, Ash of War, it's going to increase the damage of that, and that's huge for this. We use that a lot. And Magic Scorpion Charm is there to increase not only the damage of your weapon when you're buffed, but also the spells that you do because they all deal magic damage. You can replace this with the Ritual Sword Talisman if you don't have this one. And Millicent's Prosthesis is there to increase your damage as you hit rapidly, which you will with double slash, and to also give you 5 dexterity because we have Keen Scaling that works really well. However, if you don't have this one, you can replace this with Rotten Wing Sword Insignia. That will also work very well. And the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman is there just to increase our protection further because we are using one Scorpion Charm and we don't have the heaviest armor. This is going to give you more physical protection, which will help you in NG+. So I use a lot of different spells for this build, and you can obviously supplement these spells with whatever spells you like because there's really no limit here other than the intelligence that we have. We have 60 intelligence. You can use any spells that are up to that requirement, which is most of them. But the first one I use is Great Blade Phalanx. This spell is absolutely great for staggering enemies. We aren't going for staggers with this build like you would with a Moonveil type setup where you use that spell and you go into the Transient Moonlight and stagger them. So it's not something I use as much with this build, but every so often it's nice to have if you want to get a little stagger damage build up on an enemy or just get some damage into them, like you have time to prep before they close the distance to you. Scholar's Armament is there to buff our weapon here. Because we have physical damage and Keen Scaling, we can buff with Scholar Armament. And the damage you'll gain between Keen Scaling and buffing with Scholar's Armament is actually higher than you'd get if you were set to like Magic or Cold Affinity at this point. So we've actually overtaken it, and as you progress further and further into NG+, the physical damage is going to go up as you increase dexterity, and the magic damage is going to go up even further as you increase intelligence and get better sorcery scaling. What I really like about Scholar's Armament, it has a very long duration, so it's not something you have to buff with all the time, meaning that you can usually buff once before a boss battle and you don't have to rebuff, although sometimes you might have to. And it doesn't take super long to do. Usually you'll get used to how long this takes, and you should be able to pull it off no problem if you need to. I also use Freezing Mist with this build. This is usually what I lead boss fights with in order to set the Frostbite status effect on enemies to further reduce their protection, increasing the damage that we deal. So I'll go into a boss fight, cast Freezing Mist after buffing my weapon, and then kind of wait for that Frostbite to build up, trying to move around them, hold them in place, and then I'll go to town once it's triggered. Terra Magica is a great way to increase your magic damage, not only with your melee attacks when you're buffed with Scholar's Armament, but also your spells, because again, they're all magic damage. So you're going to want to use this one when you can. It's not always applicable. You can't always get it off in a fight, and even if you can, you can't always stand there. But you definitely want to learn to recognize the fights where you can stay more stationary and use this when you can. The next spell I use here is Founding Rain of Stars. This is another spell that's really good to throw up on a boss that's stationary or doesn't move around that much. Preemptively cast it, wait for them to move towards you, and then fight them while they're standing under it to get increased damage while you go to town with Double Slash. I also have Loretta's Great Bow here. This gives you a good ranged option from very, very far away. This is primarily a melee build. Obviously, we're playing a samurai build. But every so often, just having a ranged ability or a ranged spell that you can snipe enemies with will get you out of a bad situation if you had to aggro a lot of enemies at once. Another spell I have on here is Carrion Retaliation. This is just kind of a fun spell you don't use very often, but it basically allows you to parry projectiles and spells. This can be really great, particularly if you're like PvPing or something where an enemy doesn't expect you to be able to parry with your staff out. It's not something they're going to expect. And obviously there are a lot of enemies that chuck projectiles at you, or bosses. Not a ton, but some. So it's just nice to have this every so often for the effect. It's not one you really need, but it's just kind of one that's fun to play around with. And lastly, I have Unseen Form here. Between the muffled sound from your chest piece and this removing the visual effects of you, can make it really easy to sneak up on enemies sometimes. It doesn't seem to work as well as you think it would, but there are scenarios where, maybe you're running through the front gate of Stormveil, and it will cause a scenario where they don't see you for much longer, allowing you to get by areas like that. And there are just a lot of areas in the game where it can make things a little bit easier, and you might as well use it if you got it. As I mentioned, you can add other spells to this. These are not the only spells you can use, but these are the ones that I like to use with this build. This allows you to use magic and still really lean into that katana playstyle. Otherwise, if you're using a lot of ranged spells, you're playing more like a mage than you would, playing like a samurai build, which is fine. But I really like that samurai style play, which is why I picked these ones. When it comes to stats for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 30 Mind, 20 Endurance, 18 Strength, 47 Dexterity, 60 Intelligence, 7 Faith, and 9 Arcane. These stats are for level 157, so obviously as you go into NG Plus further, these are going to increase. But that's what I have right now at the moment. 50 Vigor is a good number at this point of the game. You can increase this up to 60 as you go through NG+, but I find it's enough for what I'm trying to do. 30 Mind is great here. Gives you a lot of FP to buff with, to cast spells. You'll probably want to increase this at some point in NG+, maybe up to 35 or 40. I don't think you need to go too much higher than that in NG+, but if you go up to NG++, you'll probably want to take this up to 50 or so. 20 Endurance is probably a little more than we need for this build with the setup that I have, but if you're using a heavier armor set, you're going to need more Endurance. And if you want to try and get a lot more poise so that you can use Double Slash more easily without being interrupted, you probably need to increase this at some point. 18 Strength is there simply to be able to use the Nagakiba one-handed. There isn't really much point in two-handing this weapon with this build. A lot of builds, when I'm playing a samurai, I like to two-hand my katana, but here the damage difference between one-handing and two-handing it is 4 damage. It's really not worth it, and that'll keep you the flexibility to be able to cast spells at will without having to un-two-hand. So I don't recommend two-handing with this build, and that's why we have 18 Strength. I also have 47 Dexterity and 60 Intelligence at this point. You can take Dexterity up to 50 here, but then I would keep increasing Intelligence up to 80 and replacing that staff, as I mentioned, with the Carrion Regal Scepter. Once you hit 80 Intelligence, then I would go back to increasing Dexterity up to 80 as well. And that's going to kind of, I wouldn't say cap you out on damage, but that's going to be, from that point forward, you're really not going to do too much more damage. But that should be easily the end of NG Plus into NG Plus Plus. So this build should make it through NG Plus absolutely no problem, and probably NG Plus Plus as well. And you don't need any Faith or Arcane for this build. Couple final tips for this build. If you're using the Flask of Wondrous Physique, I like the Magic Shroud and Crack tier in order to boost your magic damage even more. And I like the Green Burst Crystal tier to give you stamina recovery. You use a lot of stamina when casting spells. You use a lot of stamina when you're attacking regularly. It's just really good to have. You don't have a ton of stamina with this build, so regaining it quickly is very useful. And when it comes to Great Runes with this build, Godric's Great Rune is perfect. You use 6 of the 8 stats with this build, so that's going to go a long way. That's going to be like 30 levels worth of stats right there. And you can, if you want, respec as well and pull out 5 points from Strength, so that when you're using Godric's Great Rune, you meet that requirement to one hand by itself, and that would save you another 5 points. So theoretically, you can save yourself like 35 points with that setup and get yourself a lot more improved stat scores. So that wraps up the Soul Samurai build. The next build that I'm going to be covering is a Godslayer build using the Godslayer Greatsword. So for those of you who've been waiting to see that build, that should come out hopefully this week or early next week. If there's a particular build that you would like to see, please let me know in the comments below.